The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between a grocery circular and a utility bill. It wasn't a standard notice, it was a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with the seal of Sterling-Holloway Financial. 10-year-old Leo sat on the porch of the farmhouse, his fingers stained with the dark, loamy soil of the orchard his grandfather had planted 40 years prior. He didn't know what a eminent domain acquisition was, or why a multinational bank based in a skyscraper 300 miles away wanted the 4 acres of gala and honeycrisp trees that bordered his backyard. He just knew the tone of the letter was cold, a sharp contrast to the gentle rustle of leaves that had been the soundtrack of his entire life. In the world of high-stakes commercial real estate, silence is often the most expensive commodity. Sterling-Holloway wasn't interested in the orchard for its fruit. They were interested in it for its location, a crucial intersection point for a planned data center corridor that promised to bring billions in infrastructure to the county. To the bank's board of directors, Leo's orchard wasn't a living, breathing ecosystem of heritage trees, it was a rounding error in a spreadsheet, a fractional block of land standing in the way of a $500 million development project. The conflict began not with a roar, but with a series of quiet, procedural maneuvers. The bank had quietly purchased 7,500 acres of surrounding farmland over the span of 18 months, buying out neighboring estates through shell corporations and front companies. It was a classic, land assemblage, strategy, a textbook move to isolate holdouts and render their property economically unviable. They didn't need to force Leo's family out immediately. They just needed to buy everything else, cut off the utility access points, and make the cost of maintaining the orchard outweigh the revenue generated by the fruit. Leo's father, Mark, was a man of few words and calloused hands. He spent his mornings pruning the lower limbs of the oldest trees and his afternoons looking at the notice from Sterling-Holloway with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning dread. The legal language was designed to be impenetrable. It spoke of rezoning contingencies and public utility easements. It didn't mention the fact that the bank's lawyers were banking on the family not having the capital to mount a legal defense. They assumed that a small-town fruit farmer would buckle at the sight of a formal litigation threat. But they didn't account for the way Leo saw the world. While his father saw a financial catastrophe, Leo saw a map. Leo was a child of the digital age, but he found his peace in the tactile. He spent hours in the orchard, not just tending the trees, but mapping them. He kept a large, weathered sketchbook where he drew the layout of the orchard in meticulous, vibrant crayon. He mapped the root systems, the drainage patterns, and the specific elevations of the soil. He knew every dip in the terrain that caused water to pool after a spring thaw and every ridge that shielded the younger trees from the northern winds. He didn't know the legal term for geological survey, but he knew the land better than any consultant the bank had hired to fly drones over the property. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. The bank sent representatives to the house, men in tailored suits who looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the tractor barn. They offered a buyout price that was generous on paper but insulting in reality, given the long-term value of the land they were trying to secure. When Mark refused, the tone shifted. The administrative inquiries turned into notices of non-compliance. Suddenly, the family was receiving letters claiming that their irrigation practices were violating new regional water use codes that, coincidentally, had been drafted and lobbied for by a coalition of developers associated with Sterling-Holloway. The emotional toll on the household was palpable. Leo watched his mother spend sleepless nights at the kitchen table, stacks of tax records and property deeds spread out like a puzzle with missing pieces. His father became increasingly quiet, his movements heavy and deliberate. The orchard, once a place of joy and harvest, began to feel like a cage. The bank had turned the landscape into a weapon, using zoning laws, environmental regulations, and the sheer weight of their legal department to shrink the family's world. Yet, every afternoon, Leo returned to his sketchbook. He was working on a new map, a map not of what the orchard was, but of what the bank was claiming it to be. He noticed something in the legal documents that his father had missed. In the bank's official filing for the rezoning permit, they had described the orchard as flood-prone, non-arable lowlands with no significant ecological drainage value. It was a lie, a strategic misrepresentation meant to justify the displacement of the unproductive land. Leo knew it was a lie because his crayon map told a different story. His map showed the hidden springs, the intricate network of natural swales that kept the orchard fertile, and the specific way the land supported the biodiversity of the entire valley. The stage was set for a confrontation. The bank expected a quiet surrender. They didn't know that a 10-year-old boy was about to use a box of crayons to point out the single fatal flaw in a billion-dollar legal strategy. The bank's legal strategy relied on a concept known as constructive abandonment. By painting the orchard as low value, ecologically dead, and flood-prone territory, their lawyers could bypass the stringent environmental impact assessments required for high-density commercial construction. If the land were truly a swampy, unproductive liability, the regulatory hurdle to flatten it for a data center would be significantly lower. They had filed these claims with the county planning board, and for a while, it worked. The bureaucrats, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork and the aggressive lobbying presence of Sterling-Holloway, had taken the bank's filing at face value. Mark, however, was trapped. Every time he tried to challenge the rezoning, he was redirected to a labyrinth of administrative hearings that required expensive expert witnesses he couldn't afford. An hydrologist would charge $5,000 just for an initial site visit. A land surveyor would cost 3 times that. The bank knew this, and they were squeezing the family's liquidity, knowing that a bankrupt farmer cannot afford a seat at the table of justice. Leo watched the walls closing in. He didn't understand the complex nuances of bankruptcy law, but he understood the concept of truth. In his mind, the bank wasn't just lying, they were physically wrong. He took his crayon map, a sprawling, multi-layered document where he used blue to mark the hidden underground springs and green to highlight the specific canopy density, and laid it out on a dining room table. He realized that the bank's filing had been based on a topographical survey that looked entirely different from his own observations. He began to compare the bank's official map with his own drawings. What he found was a deliberate distortion. The bank's survey had conveniently omitted the Blue Ridge Spring, a natural groundwater source that fed into the primary basin of the valley. According to the bank's map, the water flowed in a direction that supported their claim of low-value, swampy output. According to Leo's crayon map, the water flowed directly underneath the proposed site of the bank's main server facility. If Leo was right, the bank wasn't just being greedy, they were being reckless. If they built a massive data center on top of a major subterranean spring, the foundation would be unstable. It was a structural nightmare waiting to happen. The bank was so focused on the legal acquisition of the land that they had cut corners on the engineering feasibility. They had prioritized the ownership of the 7,500 acres over the integrity of the ground beneath them. Leo walked into his father's study, holding the map. "Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "They didn't measure the water." Mark looked up, tired, his eyes bloodshot from staring at legal jargon. "Leo, not now. We're losing the south pasture by Friday if the county doesn't grant an extension." "They're building it on the spring," Leo insisted, spreading the map across the desk. "Look. This is where the water comes out. If they pour concrete here, it will crack. The map they gave the county, it doesn't show the water anywhere." Mark leaned in. He knew the land, but he had never seen it articulated with such, dare we say, childlike clarity. The lines Leo had drawn were precise. He had marked the flow of the spring not by surveying equipment, but by observing where the moss grew thickest and where the ground stayed softest even during the driest summers. It was a localized, intimate knowledge that no drone-mounted sensor could replicate. Mark grabbed his phone. He didn't call the bank. He called the one person in town who actually disliked Sterling-Holloway more than he did, Sarah Jenkins, a disgraced but brilliant environmental lawyer who had been disbarred for being too aggressive against developers. She lived in a trailer near the county line and spent her days writing scathing blogs about the corruption of local land use boards. "I've got a witness," Mark said when she picked up. "I don't do pro bono, Mark," she snapped. "And I certainly don't do farm disputes anymore." "It's not a dispute," Mark countered, his heart racing. "It's a structural fraud. And I have the map that proves the bank is lying to the zoning board about the hydrology of this entire 7,500-acre project." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Sarah knew that if a bank lied on a site feasibility study, they were opening themselves up to massive liability. It wasn't just about the orchard anymore, it was about the legal validity of the entire 7,500-acre development. If they were forced to disclose the spring, the costs of re-engineering the project would skyrocket, potentially making the entire deal, the one the bank had promised its shareholders, completely unprofitable. "Bring it over," Sarah said. "And bring the kid." They drove to Sarah's trailer that evening. When she saw the map, she didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it as a child's drawing. She recognized the pattern. She knew that in court, the truth was rarely about who was right, it was about who could present the most compelling, undeniable evidence. And a map that proved a multinational bank had ignored a major water source was, in her eyes, a golden ticket. The confrontation was no longer a matter of the orchard versus the bank. It had evolved into a battle of documentation. The bank had millions of dollars in legal fees, but they were working from a flawed premise. They were operating on a map of convenience, while the family was holding a map of reality. The legal proceedings began not in a courtroom, but in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room at the county planning board. Sterling-Holloway had sent a team of high-priced associates, young, polished, and visibly bored by the prospect of dealing with a small-time farmer. Their lead counsel, Marcus Thorne, possessed the kind of detached arrogance that only comes from having never lost a case. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, tapping a gold pen against a stack of official surveys. When Mark and Sarah entered, the associates exchanged quick, smirking glances. They expected a plea for more time or perhaps a desperate attempt to negotiate a higher payout. They were entirely unprepared for the sketchbook Leo clutched in his hands. Sarah began the offensive immediately, but she kept it surgical. She didn't lead with the orchard, she led with the site feasibility study. She requested the bank's certified topographical reports, specifically the hydrological subsection regarding the 7,500-acre basin. Thorne produced them with a flourish, confident that the documents were ironclad. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the quiet room, "the bank claims this land is suitable for a heavy-load data facility because the bedrock is stable and the water table is sufficiently deep and non-volatile. Is that correct?" Thorne nodded, barely looking up from his laptop. "The studies were conducted by the top firm in the state. The data is indisputable. And yet," Sarah continued, "you have failed to account for the secondary spring line that traverses the northern quadrant of the property. Specifically, the segment that runs directly beneath the proposed cooling plant for your main server farm." Thorne paused. He finally looked up, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "There is no such spring. The survey is exhaustive. If a spring existed, it would have been flagged in the initial environmental impact assessment." "Leo," Sarah said, gesturing to the boy. Leo stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He placed his crayon map on the table. It looked absurd next to the sleek, digital prints provided by the bank's engineers, thick wax strokes against precise, computer-generated contour lines. The associates actually laughed. One of them, a man in a crisp navy suit, leaned over to whisper something inaudible to his colleague, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. "Is this a joke, counsel?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with practiced disdain. "You've brought a child's drawing to a legal hearing regarding a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project?" "It's not a drawing, Mr. Thorne," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's a record." He pointed to a cluster of blue crayon marks on the map. "The bank's map says this is solid soil. But in the spring, when the snow melts, the water doesn't drain into the creek. It pools right here, behind the old oak grove, because the ground is saturated by the underflow of the spring. If you build here, the weight of the servers will sink the foundation within 3 years. And if you try to divert the water, you'll flood the entire lower county because the channel is already at capacity." Thorne dismissed the claim with a wave of his hand. "We have professional engineering reports. This is anecdotal hearsay, entirely speculative." "It's not speculative if it's true," Sarah countered, leaning forward. "We have subpoenaed the maintenance logs of the county's irrigation district from the last 10 years. Every time there's a heavy storm, that specific sector, the one your map labels as dry, experiences a 300% increase in soil saturation. We have the data to back up the boys' map. You, on the other hand, have a survey that was likely generated by a software package that hasn't seen a real field inspection in years." The room grew very quiet. The arrogance of the bank's team began to crack. Thorne realized that Sarah wasn't just posturing. She was signaling that she had done the legwork. If the bank's own feasibility study was technically deficient, if it ignored a massive hydrogeological hazard, the entire rezoning permit was vulnerable to a massive class action challenge from the county's other landowners. "We will have our own engineers review the site again," Thorne said, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. "You can do that," Sarah replied, a predator catching the scent of blood. "But the planning board is meeting on Monday to finalize the approval. If you proceed with this application based on flawed data, you aren't just looking at a dispute with a farmer. You're looking at a perjury investigation regarding your environmental filings." The meeting ended abruptly. There were no handshakes. As they walked out, Leo felt the weight of the moment. He had stood up to the Titan, and for the first time, he saw the look of uncertainty in their eyes. They had been trying to crush his family with the weight of the law, but they had forgotten that the law is supposed to be grounded in the truth. And the truth, he now knew, was something you could map, even with a box of wax crayons. Back at the farmhouse, the victory felt fragile. They hadn't won yet, they had just delayed the inevitable. The bank was a giant, and giants don't just walk away because they got a stern look from a 10-year-old. They regroup, they recalibrate, and they hit back harder. That night, Mark didn't talk about the meeting. He sat on the porch with Leo, listening to the crickets. The orchard felt different now, less like a farm, and more like a fortress. "They'll try to find a way around it," Mark said softly. "They have more money than we could ever dream of." "Then we'll just have to show them more of the map," Leo replied. The following Monday, the pressure shifted from the courtroom to the field. Sterling-Holloway didn't retreat, they doubled down. By Tuesday morning, 3 unmarked SUVs were parked at the edge of the orchard. They weren't there for a legal negotiation, they were there for a hostile site assessment. A team of geologists, accompanied by private security contractors, began drilling test wells across the property. They were essentially trying to find evidence that the spring, and Leo's map, didn't exist, or that it was so negligible that it could be mitigated with simple concrete piers. The sound of the drill rigs was invasive. It shattered the morning peace, the mechanical thrumming vibrating through the farmhouse floorboards. Leo watched from his bedroom window as the crews marked the trees with bright red plastic tape, the same trees his grandfather had planted, now designated as obstacles to be removed. It was a calculated psychological campaign. They were showing the family exactly what the end looked like: noise, intrusion, and the inevitable destruction of their heritage. Sarah arrived shortly after, looking frantic. "They're trying to brute force the geology," she explained to Mark and Leo in the kitchen. "They know if they can find a way to divert the water underground, they can claim the site is technically remediated and secure the zoning approval. They aren't trying to prove the map wrong, they're trying to physically change the land to make the map irrelevant." Leo felt a surge of indignation. "They can't just move a spring, Dad. It's not like moving a bucket of water. It's the heart of the orchard." "They know that," Mark said, his jaw tight. "But they don't care about the orchard. They care about the data center. If they can get the permit, they'll dump millions into concrete and steel to stabilize the ground. The trees will die, the spring will be buried, and they'll have their tax credits." The struggle had become a race against time. The bank was attempting to rewrite the reality of the land before the planning board could convene for the final vote. Leo realized that his Crayon map, while accurate, was being dismissed by the bank's experts as observational data. To beat them, he needed to translate his observations into language they couldn't ignore, the language of systemic, long-term catastrophe. He spent the next 48 hours in a blur of activity. He wasn't just drawing anymore. He was using the internet to pull public records of previous, similar projects Sterling-Holloway had invested in. He found a pattern. 3 years ago, in a different state, the bank had backed a shopping mall development that had suffered a catastrophic sinkhole failure, a disaster that had cost them hundreds of millions in litigation. He began cross-referencing that site's geology with his own. He realized that the same firm, the same engineering consultants they were using now, had been involved in that project. The patterns were identical. The soil density, the water table levels, the susceptibility to subsurface erosion, it was a carbon copy of the disaster that had already bankrupted a smaller developer years ago. Leo didn't just have a map, he had a precedent. He took his notes and his sketchbook to Sarah's trailer. When she looked at the comparisons, her eyes went wide. She saw what Leo had discovered: the bank was using the exact same playbook, with the exact same flawed engineering firm, that had led to a massive, documented failure elsewhere. It wasn't just negligence, it was a repeating cycle of corporate recklessness. "This changes everything," Sarah whispered. "This isn't just about an orchard anymore. This is about a pattern of predatory development that puts the entire county at risk. If we bring this to the press, and to the state-level regulatory agencies, the bank won't just lose the permit. They'll face a full-scale inquiry into their entire development division." The mood in the trailer shifted from defensive to offensive. They weren't just fighting to save the farm, they were preparing to expose a giant. But as they worked, they heard a crash outside. A heavy-duty bulldozer had accidentally veered off the access road, plowing through the fence line and crushing a row of young gala trees. The driver, a man in a hard hat, climbed out, shrugging his shoulders as if it were a simple mistake. It was a clear act of intimidation. They were signaling that the barrier between the legal battle and physical destruction had officially collapsed. Mark stood on the porch, his fists clenched, watching the machine rumble back and forth, tearing up the soil. Leo stood beside him, clutching his updated map. The ink and wax were smeared, the paper wrinkled, but the truth it held was sharper than ever. "They think they can just knock it all down, don't they?" Leo asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. "They do," Mark replied. "But they're making a mistake. They think they're fighting a farmer. They don't realize they're fighting for the truth." Leo looked at the bulldozer, then at his map. He knew exactly what he had to do. He had to make sure that the people who held the power to stop the bank, the public, the board, and the regulators, saw exactly what the bank was destroying. He wasn't just going to present a map, he was going to tell a story that the bank couldn't talk their way out of. The final hearing was packed. The gallery, usually a graveyard for local politics, was filled with farmers, townspeople, and even a handful of local news reporters who had been tipped off by Sarah. The air was thick with tension. Marcus Thorne sat at the front, looking as composed as ever, but there was a subtle twitch in his jaw, a sign that he realized the narrative had shifted beyond his control. When the chairperson called for final statements, Sarah didn't bother with a formal opening. She simply walked to the projector screen and nodded to Leo. The boy stood up. He wasn't the intimidated child who had first entered this room, he was a witness testifying to a reality that everyone else had been too blinded by money to see. He didn't use technical jargon. He didn't cite obscure legal statutes. He clicked a button on the projector, and his crayon map, scanned and digitized, filled the wall behind him. "This is my home," Leo began, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. "But this map isn't about my home. It's about the truth of this valley." He pointed to the areas where the bank had conducted their drilling. "These are the points where they've been digging for the last 3 days. They've been looking for a way to build over the water. But they aren't looking at the history of their own mistakes." Leo then pulled up a second document, the record of the sinkhole disaster from the previous state. He laid his map over the topographical layout of that failed project. The parallels were undeniable. He showed how the soil structure at his orchard matched the soil structure of the site that had collapsed, and how the bank's refusal to acknowledge the subterranean spring was not a simple oversight, but a systemic pattern of negligence. "They aren't just trying to crush an orchard," Leo said, looking directly at the planning board. "They are trying to repeat a catastrophe. If they build here, they aren't just taking my land. They are building a multi-billion-dollar structure on a foundation that will eventually fail, putting the entire county's water table and local infrastructure at risk. They aren't just bad neighbors. They are a danger to this community." The room erupted into a low hum of chatter. Even the board members, who had previously seemed resigned to approving the project, were leaning forward, their faces etched with alarm. The implication was clear: if they voted to approve, and a collapse occurred, the blood, and the financial liability, would be on their hands. Thorne stood up to object, but his voice was drowned out by the audible gasps of the public as Leo displayed a final piece of evidence. Internal bank communications Sarah had managed to subpoena, detailing the bank's awareness of the soil instability in their previous projects. It was the smoking gun. The bank hadn't just ignored the risks, they had calculated that it was cheaper to build and pay for damages later than to change their engineering plans now. The hearing was over before it officially ended. The board chairperson, looking visibly disgusted, called for an immediate suspension of the zoning application pending a full, independent, third-party geological audit, an audit the bank would have to pay for, and one that they knew would never approve their current plans. As they walked out of the building, the sun was setting over the valley. The orchard remained. The bulldozer was still parked at the edge of the property, its engine silent, a useless hunk of metal that had failed to overwrite the landscape. Mark put a hand on Leo's shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and profound relief. "You did it, son," he whispered. "You saved it." "I didn't save it, Dad," Leo said, tucking his sketchbook under his arm. "The land just told the truth. I was just the one who drew it." The aftermath was swift. The bank, facing a public relations disaster and the threat of a state-level regulatory investigation, quietly withdrew their development plans for the region. The 7,500 acres were eventually sold off, piece by piece, to a coalition of local farmers and conservation groups. The orchard was preserved as a heritage site, a testament to the fact that no amount of corporate capital can truly own a place that is deeply and fundamentally known. In the years that followed, the story of the Crayon map became a legend in the county. It served as a reminder that the most sophisticated systems of power are often the most fragile when confronted with the stubborn, simple clarity of the truth. Leo grew up, though he never stopped drawing. He went on to study civil engineering, armed with a perspective that many of his peers lacked, the understanding that when you build, you aren't just moving dirt. You are engaging in a dialogue with the earth itself. The orchard stands to this day. The trees are older now, their branches heavy with fruit, their roots deep in the soil that the bank once tried to pave over. It is a quiet, thriving place, a living, breathing rebuttal to the idea that anything is ever truly just a piece of land. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the gala trees, you can almost hear the rustle of a 10-year-old sketchbook pages. It is a reminder that the world is built on more than contracts and spreadsheets. It is built on the hidden springs, the subtle slopes, and the people, regardless of their age, who are willing to take the time to map out the reality of the ground beneath their feet. The battle was won not with money or influence, but with the persistence of a child who saw the world for what it really was, and refused to let the truth be erased by a margin of profit. The bank eventually moved on to other projects, other valleys, and other targets, but in this one corner of the world, they met a force they couldn't calculate, the immovable, unwavering persistence of a boy who believed that the truth mattered. And in the end, that was exactly what changed everything.